How long does it actually take? That is the question this entire series has been building toward. 6 videos examining the mechanisms of reserve currency decline, the bond markets, the gold, the oil, the middle class, the sanctions, the internal politics. 6 videos documenting the pattern, the precedents, the historical forces currently in motion, but none of them answered the question that matters most practically. How long does this take? Not in theory. Not as a range of possibilities, an actual documented history measured in years with the specific milestones mapped and the timeline recorded. That is what this video does, and what history reveals when you actually sit down and measure it is both more reassuring and more alarming than most people expect. More reassuring because the timelines are longer than the crisis-focused financial media suggests. More alarming because in every single transition, the final acceleration, the phase where the transition moves from gradual erosion to visible, undeniable change, arrived faster than almost anyone predicted and came after years of apparent stability during which most observers had concluded the threat had passed. Before mapping the timeline, the measurement methodology requires careful attention, because the question, how long did it take, depends entirely on where you start and stop the clock. A reserve currency transition has, in the historical record, 4 identifiable phases that can be distinguished with reasonable precision after the fact. Phase 2 is the first visible crack, a specific identifiable event or period that reveals a fundamental structural vulnerability in the dominant currency's position for the first time. This is not yet a transition. The dominant currency typically recovers from Phase 2 events and may remain dominant for decades afterward. But Phase 2 events mark the beginning of the clock in any serious historical analysis because they are retrospectively identifiable as the moment when the system's ultimate trajectory became, in principle, predictable. This is not easy. Phase 3 is contested transition, the period during which the dominant currency is clearly declining in relative terms. Alternatives are actively being built and used, and the question is no longer whether a transition will occur, but when and how quickly. This phase is characterized by high volatility, multiple crises, and periodic recoveries that create false impressions of stabilization. Phase 4 is transfer, the period when a new currency or system achieves the structural dominance previously held by the declining currency or system achieves the structural dominance previously held by the declining currency on the transition is formally or practically complete. Measuring the gap between Phase 2 and Phase 4, the earliest reserve currencies of the modern era, the Portuguese real in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, and the Spanish pieces of 8 in the 16th and 17th centuries, offer precedents that are distant enough in time that the data is less precise, but close enough in structural logic that the patterns are directly relevant. Portugal's moment of Phase 1 dominance was brief by historical standards, roughly the period from Vasco da Gama's establishment of the Indian Ocean trade route in 1498 to the early decades of the 16th century. When Portuguese spice trade dominance gave the really unusual global reach for a small country with a limited domestic economy. The Phase 2 crack came with Spain's rise as a dominant power following the conquest of the Americas and the extraordinary influx of silver from Potosi and other New World mines. Phase 4, the effective displacement of Portuguese trade dominance by Spanish silver, was substantially complete by the mid-16th century, total duration roughly 50 years. The Spanish pieces of 8 present a more instructive case because the timeline is more precisely documented. Spanish silver dominated international trade settlement from roughly the mid-16th century through the late 17th century, a dominance of approximately 115 years. Phase 2 arrived in the late 16th and early 17th centuries as Dutch commercial and financial sophistication began to outcompete Spanish military-backed mercantilism for actual control of the world's most valuable trade routes. The Spanish crown's repeated sovereign defaults. In 1557, 59, 59, 59, 59, 57, 167, 167, 164 eroded the credibility of Spanish financial obligations and drove international financial obligations, where Dutch financial innovation was creating instruments that Spanish bullion mercantilism could not match. Phase 4. The clear ascendancy of Amsterdam and total duration from first visible crack to transfer is rather the center of global finance, was substantially complete by the 1660s. Total duration from first visible crack to transfer, roughly 70 years. 2 lessons emerged from dominance once established is extraordinarily durable. Second, the decline phase, once the structural vulnerabilities become visible, spans generations rather than years. The Spanish case in particular demonstrates something that will recur in every subsequent transition, the existence of multiple apparent stabilizations, moments when the declining power seemed to have arrested its decline, that retrospectively turn out to have been pauses within a longer downward trajectory rather than genuine reversals. The Dutch guilder's rise and fall as a reserve currency is the first transition in monetary history that is documented in sufficient detail through contemporaneous financial records, central bank data, and trade statistics to permit the kind of precise phase analysis this video is attempting. Phase 1 dominance, roughly 1640 to 720, the period during which Amsterdam was unambiguously the world's financial capital, the Dutch East India Company was the most powerful commercial entity on earth, and the guilder was the currency in which international trade was denominated and settled, the currency in which international trade was denominated and settled across Europe. And phase 2. First extremity were the Netherlands under Louis XIV, occupying much of the country, the Dutch Republic's political and military fragility. Phase 3. Contested transition, roughly 70-20-70-80, the period during which Dutch financial dominance was clearly declining relative to Britain's rising commercial and financial power. Dutch investors were increasingly exporting capital to London rather than deploying it domestically, and Amsterdam was transitioning from being the world's financial center to being an important but secondary node in a system increasingly centered on London. Phase 4. Transfer, roughly 70-80 to 1815, the period spanning the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, was 70-70-80-74, which effectively destroyed the Dutch Navy in 70-40-70-80, which effectively destroyed the Dutch Navy and severely damaged Dutch trade through the Napoleon. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 marked the formal beginning of the British-centered world order. Duration from Phase 2 to Phase 4, approximately 43 years. That number deserves to be stated clearly because it is jarring to modern ears accustomed to thinking about reserve currency transitions in terms of years or decades. From the first visible crack in Dutch financial dominance in 1602 to the final transfer of financial primacy to Britain in 1853, years elapsed. Generations lived and died within the transition. Multiple apparent stability years elapsed. Generations lived and died within the transition. Moments when Dutch financial power seemed to have arrested its decline turned out to be pauses within a longer trajectory. The first century of that 14-3-year period, from 672 to roughly 1780, was a period of relatively slow, gradual erosion. Dutch financial dominance was declining, but it was declining slowly, and in many years it was not obvious to contemporary observers that a transition was underway. The final 60 years, from 1780 to 1815, were dramatically more turbulent, where transition accelerated sharply in its final phase. After a long period of gradual erosion, this financially accelerated sharply in its final phase. After a long period of gradual erosion, the British pound's rise and fall as the world's reserve currency is the best documented transition in monetary history and the one most directly analogous to the current American situation in structural terms. It deserves the most detailed treatment. Phase 1 dominance, roughly 1815 to 1914, the period of classical gold standard and British financial primacy, during which the pound sterling was the world's unquestioned reserve currency. London was the center of global finance, and the British Empire underpinned both with the most powerful naval and military force in the world. Phase 2, first visible crack, 1914 to 1919. The First World War revealed the full extent of Britain's structural financial vulnerability, its dependence on American capital to finance the war, the exhaustion of its foreign investment position, and the dramatic shift in the global balance of economic power toward the United States. By the war's end, the United States had moved from the world's largest debtor nation to its largest creditor. Britain had moved in the opposite direction. The Phase 2 crack for the pound was not a single event, but a 4-year process that made undeniable what had been theoretically possible for decades: that the United States had the economic capacity to displace Britain as the world's dominant financial power. Phase 3, contested transition, 1919 to 1944, the interwar period during which Britain desperately attempted to restore pre-war sterling normalcy, the disastrous 1995 return to gold at pre-war parity, the 1931 forced departure from gold, the sterling area arrangements of the 1930s while the United States consolidated its financial dominance without yet assuming the institutional responsibilities of a reserve currency issuer. This was a period of genuine, prolonged uncertainty about which currency would ultimately anchor the post-war monetary system. The dollar did not achieve reserve currency status automatically or immediately after the war. It achieved it through specific, contested institutional choices made at Bretton Woods in 1944. Phase 4 transfer, 1945 to 1976. The formal transfer of reserve currency status to the dollar at Bretton Woods in 1955, followed by the 3 decades of managed sterling decline through the Suez crisis, the 1967 devaluation, and the final IMF bailout of 1976, which marked the practical end of sterling's pretensions to reserve status. Duration from phase 2 to phase 4, 60 years using the broadest definition, 1914 to 1976. 30 years using a narrower definition that marks phase 4 as beginning at Bretton Woods, 1950. By any measure, the British transition was substantially faster than the Dutch, reflecting the more intense competitive dynamics and the more compressed historical timescales of the 20th century relative to the 17th. The rapid acceleration phenomenon appeared in the British case as well, but in a different form. Rather than a smooth acceleration within the transition, the British case featured multiple apparent stabilizations. The pound's return to gold in 1950, the relative stability of the 1950s, interrupted by sharp crises that each ratcheted the transition forward by a decisive step. The Suez crisis of 1956, the 1960 devaluation, the 1960 IMF bailout, each one of these was a moment when observers had been predicting stabilization only to have a crisis reveal. Phase 4 transfer, 1951 to 1956, the formal transfer of reserve currency status to the dollar at Bretton Woods in 1950, followed by the 3 decades of managed sterling decline through the Suez crisis, the 1960 devaluation, and the final IMF bailout of 1966, which marked the practical end of sterling's pretensions to reserve status. Duration from phase 2 to phase 4, 60 years, using the broadest definition, 1955 to 1966. 30 years using a narrower definition that marks phase 4 as beginning at Bretton Woods, 1964 to 1950. By any measure, the British transition was substantially faster than the Dutch, reflecting the more intense competitive dynamics and the more compressed historical time scales of the 20th century relative to the 17th. The rapid acceleration phenomenon appeared in the British case as well, but in a different form. Rather than a smooth acceleration within the transition, the British case featured multiple apparent stabilizations, the pound's return to gold in 1965, the relative stability of the 1950s, interrupted by sharp crises that each ratcheted the transition forward by a decisive step, the Suez crisis of 1956, the 1967 devaluation, the 1967 IMF bailout. Each one of these was a moment when observers had been predicting stabilization only to have a crisis reveal that the underlying trajectory had not actually changed. The most defensible historical analysis treats all three as part of a compound phase 2, a series of escalating structural revelations rather than a single event, with 1979 as the beginning of phase 2 and 2020D as its most recent and most consequential expression. If 1979 is the start of the clock, where does that put the dollar relative to the historical templates? Compared to the British template, a 55-year phase 2 duration would put the dollar roughly in the middle of the contested transition phase, comparable to the British pound's position in the late 1930s or early 1940s. The Dutch template, with its much longer timeline, would suggest the dollar is still in the early stages of a process that could extend for another century. The Spanish template, with its repeated sovereign defaults and its 70-year transition, would put the dollar at a more advanced stage closer to the final transfer phase. The historical pattern of slow erosion followed by rapid final acceleration creates a specific practical challenge. The transition appears manageable until it suddenly isn't. The people living through the gradual phase, the British pound holders of the 1970s and 1930s, the Dutch guilder advocates of the early 18th century had reasonable grounds for believing the system was stable, because in most years the decline was too slow to be decisively visible. What the historical record identifies retrospectively as the signals that preceded rapid acceleration is therefore enormously valuable, and across all three major transitions several common signals appear. The first signal is capital flow reversal. In every transition, there came a period when the previously steady flow of foreign capital toward the dominant currency, buying its bonds, holding its reserves, investing in its financial markets, began to reverse, not dramatically at first, but measurably. In the Dutch case, Dutch investors began placing more capital in British consols than in Dutch securities in the early 18th century, Dutch money moving away from Dutch assets before the Dutch themselves had fully acknowledged the transition. In the British case, The steady flow of British capital to American markets accelerated in the 1920s and 1930s, even as official British policy insisted on pound sterling primacy. In the current dollar context, the central bank gold buying documented in this series the quiet diversification of reserve compositions away from dollar-denominated assets and the bilateral yuan settlement arrangements multiplying across the global south all rhyme structurally with this capital flow reversal signal. The second signal is trade settlement diversification. In every transition, the declining currency first lost its role in trade settlement at the margins, in bilateral trades between countries where the dominant currency had the weakest network effects. Before that, diversification spread to more central trade relationships. The yuan oil settlements between China and Gulf producers, while still a small share of total global oil trade, matched the early stage trade settlement diversification signal precisely. The third signal is bond market stress specific to the declining currency's sovereign debt. In every transition, the declining powers bond market began to show persistent stress, rising yields, reduced foreign demand, periods of disorderly auction before the transition was widely acknowledged. The Dutch case saw rising interest rates on Dutch government bonds in the early 18th century. The British case saw periodic sterling crises that pressured yield markets through the interwar period. The current US Treasury market, as documented in the first video of this series, is exhibiting structural stress signals that match this pattern. The fourth signal is political fragmentation that prevents effective fiscal response. As documented in the previous video in this series, the internal order cycle's impact on fiscal capacity was a consistent feature of the late stages of every transition. The declining power's internal political conflict prevented the decisive fiscal adjustment that might have extended the transition or altered its trajectory. By this framework, the dollar currently exhibits all four acceleration signals, not at the intensity that marked the. Drawing directly from the historical templates, what does the documented evidence actually imply about the timeline of any potential dollar transition? The most compressed historical template, the Spanish pieces of 8, suggests a phase 2 to phase 4 duration of roughly 70 years from the moment of first visible structural vulnerability. On this template, with 1971 as phase 2, the dollar's transition would reach phase 4 completion somewhere around 2040. The British template, the closest structural analogue to the American case in terms of the nature of financial dominance, the scale of the underlying economy, and the institutional complexity of the transition, suggests a phase 2 to phase 4 duration of between 30 and 60 years, depending on how phase 4 completion is defined. On this template, with 1971, a 30 to 50 year transition window is, in human terms, a single lifetime. It is the span of an entire career. It encompasses the full arc of most people's wealth-building years, from early adulthood through retirement. This is why the historical record on reserve currency transitions is not merely academic. It is directly practically relevant to decisions that ordinary people make about how to save, invest, and plan for the future. The person who entered the British workforce in 1923, who saved in sterling, invested in British government bonds, and built their retirement on the assumption that the financial environment of their parents' generation would persist, lived through every major phase of the sterling transition, the 1950 gold return and the deflation it caused, the 1931 departure from gold and the devaluation, the Suez crisis, the 1916 devaluation. Their lives' financial decisions were shaped in ways they may not have fully understood by a historical process whose timeline they had no framework for comprehending. The person who entered the workforce with a clear understanding of the transition, who diversified across currencies and asset classes, who held real assets as well as paper ones, who did not mistake the long pauses in the transition for a permanent stabilization, was in a very different position through each of those events. This is the fundamental purpose of the historical framework this entire series has been building, not to generate precise predictions, not to provide investment advice, but to offer the historical literacy that allows the person watching this video to understand the process they are living through, to see the individual events, bond market stress, central bank gold buying, yuan oil settlements, internal political conflict as phases of a documented historical pattern rather than isolated surprises. The clock is running. History documents its approximate speed. What you do with that information is yours to decide. 7 videos, 7 mechanisms, 1 historical argument. The bond market is breaking. Central banks are buying gold. The petrodollar is under military and geopolitical pressure. The middle class is absorbing the wealth transfer that marks every late cycle phase in monetary history. The dollar weapon has accelerated the very transition it was built to prevent. The internal politics of the declining empire are fracturing along the lines that history has seen before. And the historical clock, running for 53 years since Nixon closed the gold window, places the dollar at a phase of transition that has clear historical precedent. None of this is a prediction, it is a map. The map that every previous generation living through a comparable transition did not have or did not know how to read. This channel exists to give you that map. The next series will go deeper into something that this series has touched but not fully explored: the specific asset classes, geographic diversifications, and financial structures that the historical record identifies as having preserved wealth most reliably across the 3 most comparable transitions in monetary history. Not in the abstract, in the documented specific detail that the historical record preserves precisely for this purpose. Subscribe, because the map is only useful if you're following it.